My name is Patrick Biber. I am an associate professor in coastal sciences, and I work at the Gulf Coast Research Laboratory in Ocean Springs. My research is looking at how coastal wetlands, marshes in particular, are responding to environmental changes. One of the major ones is how sea level rise is going to influence where marshes can persist into the future.
Well, we had a building here. It got damaged in Katrina, and we kept part of the building. And then at some point, the maintenance and the repair of what would have been necessary to keep that building was deemed to be more than what the use of the building was worth. So the building was removed, and now we've kind of remediated this space into green space. So that's a good example of how, we can get some of that built infrastructure out of the way over time and let the natural progression of the vegetation preserve some of that habitat. This indoor space was pretty helpful, especially when it's really hot in summer. So we've ended up using the greenhouse more just for winter operations. And we tend to either have the seedlings indoors like this during the summer. The ones that grow faster are the ones that usually end up doing better in terms of a lot of the burial of carbon, a lot of the removal of nutrients. All of that's happening in the mud and in the root zone. And the upper part of the plant is important to keep the roots healthy. But in terms of a lot of the things that are going on in the marsh that we really care about, it's what's happening down here. This was for some animal experiments. It actually had a door and you could manipulate the temperature. I've repurposed it just for some plant flats. And like I said, these are some juncus seedlings. These are about 2 weeks since I put the seeds in there. You can just see them starting to grow. So the same thing will happen with the Spartina seeds. Starting in the early part of the year, we'll put the seeds in these flats of soil. We'll add water, and after about 7 to 10 days, the seeds will germinate, and we'll have the little Spartina seedlings growing out of the soil. Over about 6 weeks, that's usually about how long I'll keep them in here, and then we'll move them out of here, and we'll move them down to my main growing area. So one of the reasons I like to have the greenhouse is it kind of gives the plants a little bit of a head start for a spring planting event. They're a little bit further along than if we were to grow them outside. They have had more time to get nice and healthy and ready to grow. But you can see we had those little tiny sprouts, they were a couple of millimeters tall, a couple of weeks old. This is what they turn into after a couple of years of growing. We have really dense, really tall, looks like just out in the natural marsh, and this entire pot is basically full of roots. So one of the things that's important is growing down here in the low marsh because it's the plant that can best tolerate the high salt and being in the water a lot. The issue here is really that it gets squeezed down to this zone because juncus comes in and takes over the space here in the mid-marsh. So the dynamic of what's going on and why we have these zones is largely driven by abiotic stress. We have biotic competition. These plants are competing and are better competitors than Spartina alterniflora once we have that influence of the tides and the salty water. We have our marsh, and we've got stuff that people have built. There used to be a forest here, but we chopped the forest down. So, what are the consequences of the research? Why is this important? Over decades, we see that the ocean has basically come up and is now covering the Spartina alterniflora zone. Well, Spartina is not going to stand for that. It's not going to say, oh, I give up. It's going to do what Spartina does, and it's going to go, all right, well, I'm going to go up here because this is where I'm good. And juncus is going to go, well, okay, you're pushing me out, so I'm going to go up here. And the high marsh is going to go, oh, well, I guess I don't really have anywhere to go, so I guess I'm going to get squeezed in there. As the ocean keeps getting higher, the marsh is getting more and more compressed. Well, some of the consequences of that are because the waters come up and there's less marsh to kind of help break some of that wave energy and reduce the wave damage. And then eventually, the marsh has gotten squeezed away. because the road's still here and there's just no place for the plant. And so we have another storm. Well, the storm blew all the trees away and I guess it broke the house. We could rebuild the house. And what if we took out the road and said, we want to have green space, and we put the marsh back? So as sea level goes down, the marshes have gone down the slope with it, and the trees have sort of followed suit. And now we're in a period where sea level is rising. And so one of the things that we are doing is really trying to model how this process occurs mathematically to represent how that coastline looks under different amounts of sea level. So this is one of the other very common ways of protecting your house. This is a bulkhead or a seawall. So now we have the same problem of coastal squeeze, but instead of a road or a house, we have this seawall, which is here as flood protection, right? So if we have a storm surge or a bigger storm surge or even a pretty big storm surge, the house is still protected. So as this habitat becomes smaller, if it goes away entirely, it's not clear that some of those species, some of those fishery species will really still have the kind of environment that they need. And so one of the kind of interesting questions, at least to me, what does it take to preserve this configuration? We want to have our cake and we want to eat it too. We want to have our happy marsh and all our fish and a safe place to live. And I think after Katrina here, we kind of saw a lot of that. If we think about the point in Biloxi and how many houses were there in 2004 before the storm versus how little has rebuilt there, that's certainly an example of how market forces and people's unwillingness to kind of go back into the risk zone has shaped what could be is already kind of a much greener landscape than it was. If we look at some of the sea level rise projection maps, the city of Pascagoula and Moss Point under a 6-foot sea level rise, which is fairly likely now. So, there are different opinions by different members of society and the community, but I think in general we do see that there is a interest by a lot of people to continue to have these natural habitats. So one of the activities that we can do to help offset some of the marsh losses is coastal restoration. And the purpose of the restoration was essentially to reuse dredge material from the shipping channel. And so over time, we can have multiple plant rhizomes growing in different directions and so on. We'll have a whole lot of Spartina alterniflora out there, and it'll look like a nice dense marsh. Vegetative growth is pretty important. And it could be a clump washing ashore, or it could be humans coming over in their little boat, and we get off and we stick them in the ground. These may have been growing in the nursery, and then over time we have vegetative expansion from the rhizomes, and they kind of grow out, and the plants colonize the open area. So over the course of a couple of years, either from natural processes or from planting, and so over time we have exactly what we'd expect. We have our lovely salt marsh that has expanded and colonized this newly formed, newly restored land. And so a lot of the research that I've been doing is understanding when to collect, how to process, how to store, how to sprout, how to grow these from seed. One of the arguments of growing these from seeds is that each one of these is a genetically different, unique individual. A lot of restoration uses very little genetic diversity. They keep propagating the same, so there are certainly some consequences. So really all we're doing here is just sieving to get the size that captures the good seeds and get rid of the stuff we don't want on the big sieve, and the little debris will fall through to the base here. Pour out the two, and then this stuff here we also throw away. Spiders and bugs, they like to live in here. Here's another one that we like to try and get rid of. This is a fungus that infects the seeds. It's called ergot. Scientific name is claviceps. So it'll grow out of a seed. It'll look something like that. This is the fruiting body, like the mushroom of the fungus. Ergot infects rye, wheat, and some other grains that humans use. So then I go ahead and weigh out my 20 grams here. And this is just so that I have approximately equal numbers of seeds per bag that I store. One of the key things that we need to do for these seeds to be healthy and ready to sprout in the spring is to mimic what happens out in the marsh, and that is they fall off the plant, and so they're in the cold, wet mud over the winter. So they're going into their little winter sleep now, and come spring, we'll put them in some soil and get ready to sprout them. And here's our nice zonation diagram, Spartina alterniflora in our low marsh, Juncus, which tends to be spatially occupying a lot of the land in our mid-marsh, and then Spartina patens and some of the other shrubs and trees in the high marsh and high marsh transition. Some pictures that were on a certificate on a piece of paper, so they're pretty low resolution, but it gives you an idea of what the volunteers were doing. Unfortunately, when they harvested the Juncus, they didn't include a lot of the roots, and I talked a little bit about why roots are so important earlier in the greenhouse. And so you'll see in some of the subsequent pictures that they had a lot of mortality of that Juncus. It didn't really survive the transplanting. Another problem was that there was a lot of this construction ground cloth type material that was not biodegradable, and a lot of that material became exposed and was now either floating around or being washed up onto the shore during high tide. So we were looking at, are the right plants in the right place? What kind of animals are there? So we did a lot of surveys running through the marsh and got lots and lots of pictures of each of the locations. A second restoration parcel was constructed a little bit to the north and a little bit to the west. So that was a lot younger at the time we were sampling for this second project. And in terms of some of the key results, we looked at a lot of sediment parameters. The main difference was that there was a lot more sand in the restored sites. In terms of the different plant species, there was actually more diversity in the two restored sites than there was in the natural marsh site. It may take 10, 15 years or so until some of that below ground function is established. So just because it looks nice and green after a couple of years doesn't mean that it's fully replacing all of the things that a natural marsh does.